This is Pacita Abad's first retrospective. It's an exhibition that brings together over 100 objects, including really large-scale trapunto paintings, for which she was best known, as well as smaller-scale objects like clothing. It covers the entirety of her 32-year career, starting with the very early work she made as a student, learning how to draw still lives or other small-scale works on paper, to the very last work she made before she died of cancer in 2004. And throughout the entire exhibition, we really wanted to emphasize just the multifaceted nature of her practice, whether she was working in painting, sculpture, works on paper, ceramics, costumes, and of course these massive, monumental textile works of art that she called trapuntos. So we really hope through the exhibition that people get a real sense of Pacita as an artist as well as an incredible person.
Pacita often says that she wanted the audience to see the world through her work. And true enough, the coordinates in this exhibition is breathtaking. It covers a wide expanse of history. Every single one of Pacita's works is an archive of the global experience.
Pacita was born in Batanes, which is the northernmost island province in the Philippines. And from Batanes and from the Philippines, she traveled to over 60 countries on 6 continents in her 32-year career. So this exhibition really highlights her global travels in each of the countries where she lived and worked, many countries that were in different parts of the global south. She embedded herself in different artistic communities. She incorporated all these different materials and techniques into the works so that each work really reads as kind of a map of the world.
One of these amazing stories that I always remember when I was growing up was Pacita's incredible journey by land, which I'm not sure you can even do anymore given the state of the world. But Pacita traveled from Istanbul to the Philippines by land over a year.
Really was that first trip where she fell in love with different textile traditions, jewelry making traditions, and other forms of cultural making. And we have in this exhibition the very first textile she collected on that trip in Turkey, as well as some of her very first embroideries that she was making just on her clothes and Jack's clothes as they were hitchhiking to the Philippines. But it was really on that journey that she just fell in love with all these rich traditions and came back and said, I want to become an artist.
And I think that really is expressed beautifully in this first room, which is focused on Pacita's Masks and Spirits series. As she traveled and as she collected all of these experiences and references, it culminated in this incredible body of work based on indigenous masks and embracing various different types of indigenous ornamentation and textiles.
For Pacita, masks and masking traditions was very compelling to her because she was really interested in the transformative power of masks as a storytelling tool, both for individual stories and more collective forms of storytelling. So we're standing in front of a grouping of 3 works that are from Pacita's Bakongo series. These were masks that she made when she was traveling through what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Republic of Congo, and they're titled Bakongo. They're really kind of this hybrid form of abstraction and figuration, but they're based on these Bifwebe face masks that were made by the Sonye and Lube peoples, and she kind of flattens them and adds her color to them, to these striated bands that were originally these kind of wooden carved masks. But what's interesting is with these masks, when you get up close to them, you'll see buttons from the Philippines, cowrie shells from Papua New Guinea, mirror embroidery that she picked up in Rajasthan. So even though the initial referent was based on a kind of a single cultural form of making, she then incorporated all the different materials and techniques from different countries. So again, they really kind of heightened this notion of global pluralism in their very making.
And I think that's what's so extraordinary about these paintings, because as much as Pacita is really invested in depicting specific communities, as you kind of fall deeper into her world, you realize that there's also this grand ambition to relate everything and everyone and to build a much larger global community through these works.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And I think it's important to even go back to Pacita's own identity as an Ivatan woman from Batanes, a Filipina woman, an Asian diasporic woman. She really inhaled all these cultures that as she was traveling through, and really related to so many of the different makers as she was going through different parts of the global South. So it's really powerful to think about her not as a white European male artist appropriating other art forms, but really she connected to other makers as a brown woman, as a woman of color artist traveling through these spaces. One body of work is a Mass from Six Continents. This was a public installation that Pacita made for the Washington, D.C. Metro Center, which is a major transit hub in D.C. This grouping of 6 works is on view for the first time in over 30 years. So this was an installation she made in 1990. It was on view for 3 years, from 1990 to 1993, and it really serves as a global map of the world. She represented each of the inhabitable continents by a masking culture. When we look at the work from left to right, we start with Hopi mask to represent North America, Oceania mask to represent Australia and Oceania more broadly, Mayan mask to represent South America, and African mask Congo to represent the continent of Africa, Subali to represent Asia, and then at the very right, the last mask is called European mask. Europe is not really known as having masking traditions, and actually her European mask is really similar to her Bakongo mask. And for her, she kind of actually self-appropriated one of her earlier African masks in a critique of European modernism's wholesale appropriation of African art forms, and then simply labeling them modern art. This is such a powerful installation that we're so thrilled that we can bring together for the first time, again, in over 3 decades. So this door is incredible because it's a standalone sculpture, but it was a functioning door. And the story behind the door is really great. Apparently Pacita and Jack's home was broken into, and her response to that was creating this welded steel door that has this masked figure. And the figure really kind of troubles the boundaries between what's industrial, what's handmade. And then alongside the door too, we have other examples of what we might call quote unquote material culture now. We have along a wall different framed works of works on paper that she made from the Mass and Spirit series. But then we also included, it's this incredible shirt, it was actually Jack's shirt. She painted a mast on the back of his clothing, or there's her first, hand-painted poster for her first exhibition in the Philippines at the Museum of Philippine Art, where she paints herself as a masked figure. And that self-portrait would serve as a logo for the artist. She would put it on letterhead. She would put it on the back of her own clothing. So she would stamp it everywhere. And I love that notion of making herself into a mask as well, because for her, masking had so much potential in terms of telling different stories, but also transforming identities. You could wear a multiplicity of identities through masks.
Another work that's part of the exhibition is this monumental piece that's currently installed in the Walker stairwell called Marcos and His Cronies. And Pacita was very ambitious with scale. And this work, which is about 8 meters high, it blends with her deep commitment to telling political histories. She began as a student activist during the Marcos era, that really dark time in the 70s when the Philippines was under a dictatorship. And this huge painting, Marcos and His Cronies, depicts the dictator Ferdinand and his wife Imelda as these demons. But instead of referring to imagery from the Philippines, she transposes that narrative to Sri Lankan indigenous imagery. The second part of this exhibition brings together paintings intrapuntos that really highlight Pacita's engagement with political narratives. She spent time with fellow immigrants, with refugees, with Filipinos who also went through similar diasporic experiences. And it really highlights Pacita as a political artist. And in many ways, that was inevitable because Pacita was going to be a politician before she decided to become an artist.
Growing up in the Philippines, Pacita was part of a politically influential family. When she was a student at the University of the Philippines, she studied political science, and she led a student demonstration against the Marcos regime. And so because of that, her parents said, Pacita, you should leave the country for some time. So she was going to leave the Philippines. She was on her way to Madrid to continue her law studies. And she made a stop in San Francisco. She was staying with an aunt. It was supposed to be a short layover. This was in 1970. It was the height of the countercultural movement, Black Power, the Third World Liberation Strike, and it's really in San Francisco that she was exposed to different forms of art making and political agitation, and all of that became incorporated into her artwork. The Immigrant Experience series that you see in this gallery really highlights the stories of not just her own personal story of coming to the United States, but also so many other individuals that she met along the way. And it's so powerful because we have to remember that at the time when she was making these works, starting in the 80s and then moving into the 90s, it was the height of what we now know as kind of multiculturalism or quote unquote identity politics in the United States. And people of color were not being shown in museums, and especially not at this scale on museum walls. So it was a really political and radical act to paint the stories of people that were being omitted from national and official narratives and centering them in her artworks.
Pacita made this monumental painting when she was living in Bangkok. And at the time, Pacita's sister Vicky was also there working amongst the refugee camps, trying to help Cambodian refugees fleeing the Khmer Rouge and also dealing with the aftermath of the American occupation of Vietnam. And Pacita would spend hours, sometimes days, in these camps, photographing the refugees, spending time with them, hearing their stories, and really just trying to get a sense of how they were going through the struggles of day to day. And I think one really important aspect of Pacita's work was an incredible sense of empathy with the very different lives that she encountered. So she spent a lot of time with refugees, but in this room there would also be depictions of Korean shopkeepers in LA. There would be depictions of people in Guantanamo Bay. There would be portraits of Filipino nurses in DC. So this sort of incredibly textured life of people of color trying to find better lives elsewhere was represented in all its diversity in Pacita's work.
This work is called LA Liberty, and it's really the genesis of Pacita Abad's Immigrant Experience series. Pacita talks about how, as she was getting her own US citizenship, in 1994, this work is from '92, she went to Ellis Island, she was doing research, and she went to the national landmark there and was looking at all the interpretive materials. And what she saw was, of course, the histories of immigrants from Western Europe, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe to the United States. But what was missing was the histories of immigrants from Asia, from Latin America, and from Africa. And of course, she recognized that many immigrants from these places didn't necessarily come through Ellis Island, but at the same time, she said, where are our stories? And so that's what this series is really about. Here she takes this neoclassical, monochromatic, monument to American liberty, the Statue of Liberty, and she browns the Statue of Liberty. She makes her into a woman of color. And when you look close at this work, this is really where you see the trapunto technique. Pacita innovated a technique that she called trapunto painting. And trapunto comes actually from an Italian word, trapungere, which means to embroider. But for Pacita, it was really a hybrid form of painting and quilting. After she painted the surface of her canvas, she would actually add a layer of stuffing and then a backing layer of another piece of fabric. And then she would stitch all those layers together using a form of cross stitch or just a running stitch. And so we hung a number of these works in the center of the gallery because we wanted people to be able to get up close to them at the front, but then also to go around and see the backs of them. If you look at the backs of each of these works, you see that incredible hand stitching again, and you can make out the figure from those stitches. And I think I counted over 30 different colored threads that she used to stitch this work. But we thought it was so important to show the backs of the works because you see the real labor that went into each of the works making. I want to talk a little bit more about the Immigrant Experience series as a whole because it's such a powerful body of work. Earlier we talked about how she was centering the stories of people of color, of immigrants to the United States. She showed this work for the first time as a small grouping in 1994. This is actually the largest selection of these works that we're showing together ever for the first time. The works are so powerful because they not only capture current events that we may be familiar with from the 90s, like the Los Angeles uprising, that was really a major flashpoint between Korean communities, immigrant communities, and African American communities. She also depicts the Haitian refugee crisis from the 90s. She captures Mexican and Central American migrant workers who were caught at the US-Mexican border. So all of these are political events that we remember so clearly, and she saw herself in some ways as a journalist, documenting what was happening in the country. There's this incredible work called Mike and Jiva, Mixed Marriage, that captures interracial marriage and the changing demographics of the country at the time. She also was really keen to capture the everyday triumphs and sufferings of people on the periphery of power. So in many of these, they're very relatable scenes of assimilation, of immigrants who are losing their accents or parts of their culture in order to assimilate. There's an amazing work called You Have to Blend In Before You Stand Out, of this young individual who's wearing this Chicago Bulls t-shirt, Yankees baseball cap, but then also this batik sarong, and is blending into this amazing fabric of the background of the work. So she was very attuned to not just the kind of the big headlines of the day, but also the real struggles and the real celebrations and the joys too of immigrants to this country. This gallery is what we're calling Pacita at home, and hearing from her family and friends who visited her homes, every square inch of the homes was covered in pattern or pigment. If there was any type of wooden furniture, it was going to be covered in fabric scraps. Her husband Jack has this great story of how he came home one day from work and found that their car had been completely reupholstered using woven ikat. So there was really no surface that was left untouched in Pacita's world. This work here is called Baguio Fruit, and I like to think about it as Pacita's earliest trapunto painting. It's from 1981, and the origin of this work actually was in Pacita's dining room. So it's actually a tablecloth. And when you look at it closely, you can make out the lace squares and the pattern of the original tablecloth. Jack tells a story of how he accidentally spilled some red wine on it, and instead of tossing that tablecloth aside, Pacita decided to turn it into an artwork. As we were organizing this exhibition, we also had the incredible fortune of going through Pacita's archives. And so this is stacks upon stacks of photographs, correspondence, newspaper articles, textiles. And so I really wanted to bring some of that out from the archives into the exhibition space so that people could see, what she was working with or what she was being inspired by. We also have here Pacita's very first embroidery. This was a jean skirt that she made by stitching together her flared jeans. She stitched the jean pants together to make a denim skirt. There's also these two little Turkish shadow puppets on these pieces of cotton that she embroidered, and this was actually on Jack's shirt. This room really highlights, again, just how Pacita lived with her art in every aspect. She made no distinction between, 3-inch high dinner party menu that someone may discard after the fact, or a 15-foot high trapunto painting that she made as an artwork. So we're standing in the third gallery of the exhibition, which is really dedicated to Pacita's engagement with abstraction. And I want to point out here, actually, that all of the walls in this exhibition have been painted different colors. And we did that intentionally because Pacita absolutely abhorred white space. Her walls were painted every single color that you could imagine. And so we really wanted to inject that spirit and that love, the joyous love of color into the exhibition's galleries. For Pacita too, color was a celebration, but it was also political. Even though they're abstractions, they have titles like Life in the Margins or White Heightens an Awareness of the Senses. Alongside her trapunto paintings in this gallery, we're also showing for the first time publicly these costumes that Pacita made as well. Because Pacita saw no distinction between how she made one of her trapunto paintings versus how she made items of clothing. During her career, Pacita also worked as a costume designer for a number of theater productions in New York, in Washington, D.C., and in the Philippines. So this was for a production in the Philippines in the early 2000s. When you get up close to them, you see that how they were made and how they were put together with this almost patchwork quilt of different fabrics is very similar to works that we have on view in this gallery. This work is called 100 Years of Freedom from Batanes to Jolo. Pacita grew up in the northernmost island province of Batanes, and Jolo is actually the southernmost island in the Philippines. The Philippines is made up of thousands of islands in this archipelago. It is also home to over 180 ethno-linguistic groups, over 100 of which are indigenous. And as she traveled throughout the country, she gathered bits and pieces of different fabric scraps. What's so interesting about this work to me is that from a distance, it may look like a hodgepodge of different patchwork quilt of textiles, but when you look closely at each of these fabric scraps, they have so much meaning. There are, for example, scraps of piña or pineapple fibers, which was a type of fabric that came from the Americas through Spanish colonization to the Philippines. There are what she called Chinese floral silks. There's even, she calls out her grandmother's Spanish lace mantilla woven into this. So it's this incredible personal history, but also I like to say the entire history of the Philippines is in this work. And she made this in 1998, and that was the centennial of Philippine independence in 1898. And it was hung for the first time in 1998 at the Metropolitan Museum of Manila to celebrate 100 years of Philippine independence.
This painting behind me was a work that Pacita made in 1998 when she was living in Indonesia. The title of the painting is The Sky is Falling, The Sky is Falling. And Pacita made it at a very pivotal moment in Indonesian history when the Suharto regime was falling. And as the economy was collapsing, as people were protesting in the streets, Pacita, as someone not from Indonesia, she decided to actually stay in Jakarta and witness this pivotal change in not just Indonesian history, but Southeast Asian history. She observed and documented the protests. She photographed the burning buildings. And through this, she ended up producing this incredible abstract painting, which, as exuberant as it may seem, it's also this incredible depiction of political collapse. Pacita had a deep love for music. When she first moved to San Francisco in the 70s, she often talked about spending most evenings dancing in the jazz bars in the Bay Area. Blues was a constant accompaniment in her studio. There's something about the way that music, particularly blues, transforms narratives of struggle into really exuberant works of art that you can really feel in this particular body of work, which was actually the last major series of paintings that Pacita produced. In a tribute to blues, the series is called Endless Blues. When Pacita started making these paintings in 2001, she talked about how personal and political upheavals really informed these paintings. She would describe witnessing the fall of the Twin Towers in New York, but she would talk about it in the same breath as seeing Afghanistan being invaded, and how the sadness of seeing these two places close to her heart undergoing such difficulty gave birth to these paintings. It was also a difficult time personally because Pacita was diagnosed with lung cancer, and it was eventually this that would take her life. But I think in true Pacita fashion, she was able to transform these moments of difficulty, these moments of epic struggle, both personal and societal, and transform them into works that are defiantly celebratory.
In 2002, Pacita was an artist in residence at the Singapore Tyler Print Institute, which is a print workshop in Singapore. And instead of making straightforward works on paper, she made these really funky paper assemblages. This is in 2002, 2003, really towards the end of her life and the end of her career. And still, even though she was going through so many personal health struggles, she was able to bring out so much playfulness and joy in her making. And so I love these titles. This one here is called Self-Portrait. This one is called Bra Sale. And then to the left of that is Buns and Bread. And the very final one is called Take Me to the Party. When we think about printmaking or paper making, this is far from what we usually see. Here on her paper surfaces too, I mean, you see sequins, you see mirrors, you see the cowrie shells, bits of jewelry that she absolutely loved. So for her, even though she was working in the confines or the context of a print institute, she refused to be flattened to that one medium.
When Pacita was doing this residency in Singapore, she noticed that next to the building was this huge grey bridge. And in true Pacita fashion, her final work was also her most ambitious. She spent months convincing the Singapore government that this grey bridge had no business being there, and embarked on this incredible project of covering this bridge with thousands of colorful circles. And this was her last work. And there were these incredible stories of, Pacita undergoing chemotherapy in the morning, and then in the afternoon she would come to the site and actually paint. And again, this spirit of defiance, but also this refusal, to be cowed by upheaval, stare at death in the eye and make this incredible celebration as her final statement, is pure Pacita.
We're now standing in the final gallery of the exhibition, and we really hope this is an exuberant finale to the world of Pacita Abad. Pacita was born in an island, the island of Batanes, but she never learned how to swim growing up. And so she first learned how to swim as an adult, and then when she went back to the Philippines, she also got her scuba diving license. I also need to point out this t-shirt that I'm wearing is a design by Pacita. It was for the Philippine Sub-Aqua Club, which she was a member of. There was no realm more colorful and more vibrant and more brilliant than the subaquatic realm for Pacita. And so through these works, she really tried to bring that world up to the surface and share it with so many people who don't have a chance to dive hundreds of feet down under the water's surface to see them.
One other thing to think about was Pacita was making these paintings when she moved back to the Philippines again after a very long period away. For her, it's getting to know the country again, and getting to know the country at a time when it was becoming this new democracy, but at the same time there was a lot of uncertainty as the country was transitioning from 2 decades of an autocratic rule. And this invitation to the public to look underneath the surface and rediscover the sense of home.
She was very sensitive to Earth's ecosystem. She was sensitive to the fact that as a scuba diver, she was kind of in some ways impeding on a different world. And so she has this great quote where she says, every time I would jump into the water, I'd always want to say, excuse me, here I come again, because she knew there were human-made impacts and effects that were already taking place that she saw in marine life. So she was very conscious about wanting to preserve the integrity of these natural ecosystems.
It's a testament to Pacita's freewheeling and omnivorous nature that this exhibition begins with masks, goes through images of immigration, has abstraction, but then ends with this unexpected work of a massive octopus and a shark fighting. When we were trying to wrap our heads around how really to tell Pacita's story, Jack said something like, trying to understand Pacita and her work is like tangling with an octopus. And true enough, there she is. And this multi-tentacular approach to life is really in this work, in the vibrancy and in the ambition that this work represents, but also in the unexpected nature of what Pacita chooses to represent in her canvases.
She was absolutely fearless in everything that she did. She had so much confidence with what she was tackling in her life, and I think that for me is so inspiring. She threw caution to the wind. She didn't care about, what people were saying was art or not art. For her, everything was one and the same. And I think because of that, it was so hard to define her. She couldn't be put into different boxes, she couldn't be categorized, but because of that, I think it took so long for people in the art world and elsewhere to understand her, to take her seriously, right? I think for many people, her flamboyance and her flair was something that didn't seem of a piece with what we think of as high art. So for me, I think her ability to kind of break down those boundaries, those barriers, with such a spirited fearlessness is something that I find so inspiring, not just in art, but also in life.
It's taken a village to finally get to this point where we can share Pacita's tremendous work to the world and really celebrating not just Pacita's work, but actually what Pacita's work means. This need to be generous, this need to be empathetic to each other's experiences, and this need to constantly see the world in different lights. One of the joys of this exhibition is actually watching people look at these works, because that sense of wonder that she had making them then becomes infectious, and you get that sense of wonder as you're looking at them. I was talking to a curator at the opening of this exhibition a few days ago, and she told me that she only knew about Pacita last year, but that she couldn't imagine her life without Pacita now.